Hello everyone, welcome back to APUSH. Today we're going to have key concept 9.3.1, American Superpower and the End of the Cold War. So what we're looking at here is basically the very end of Cold War policy in the 1980s, and then sort of what the end of the Cold War meant for the United States, for us moving forward as the world's last superpower in the 20th century. Okay, so first thing we need to look at is what Cold War policy looked like during the Reagan administration. So here we go. So remember, Cold War policy had really undergone many different stages over time. It kind of went back and forth between kind of proxy wars and confrontation, and then areas of relative peace, which we got to know as détente. Détente is the idea of sort of trying to make an alliance, easing tensions in order to have more political and economic cooperation. Now, what happens with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s is that détente back from Richard Nixon ends, and he comes into the presidency with the idea of the United States needed to take a more competitive and a more sort of antagonistic approach to the Cold War in order to try and defeat the Soviet Union within this prolonged conflict. So, a few things he did in order to do that. He threatened to use more weaponry and technology in order to defeat them. So we've studied the nuclear arms race before, and the size of our nuclear arsenal is continuing to grow within this era. But really that wasn't enough. The idea is that we needed to have better technology, not just for the weapons, but also for the delivery of the weapons, and technology in order to prevent the Soviet weapons from getting to us. And this is where Reagan proposed something called the Strategic Defense Initiative. It was commonly known as Star Wars. It was known as Star Wars because it was basically the idea that the US was going to develop satellite technology sort of orbiting the Earth that would enable us to use lasers and weapons to shoot down Soviet missiles when they were up in the air so they could never reach us. So you could see how this would be a bit of a game changer. Going from having parity in terms of who can hit each other and sort of the range of the missiles and the size of the weapons to saying, well, we're going to do something so you can't even, you can fire on us, but they won't reach us, and then therefore we will have the upper hand. Now, what you need to know about the Strategic Defense Initiative is it didn't go anywhere. Reagan was basically kind of playing a bluff. We did not have this technology. We did not think we could reasonably develop this technology, but we knew that the threat of us making it would drive the Soviet Union to try and create it too, and possibly bankrupt their country. So this was ultimately Reagan's policy, spending a lot of federal money on the military in order to try and bankrupt the Soviet Union, to try to make them compete with us when they could not compete with us because our economy was so much larger. Some little data here. Reagan spent 43% more on the military than the US did in all of the Vietnam War. So basically, this is kind of where we get to Reagan as being kind of this contradiction. That on the one hand, he came in as a hardline economic conservative, saying the government should not be spending so much money, but then he cut back all these social programs and then significantly increased our national debt in the favor of the military and a defense buildup. He also changed the language that represented the end of détente. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire and compared the US to a shining city on a hill back from those sermons during the first Great Awakening. So basically, it wasn't just the idea of defeat them militarily, outspend them in terms of economic stuff, but also set up this difference in our ideology. The idea of we are the heroes, they are the villains, they are evil, and therefore having a cohesive nationalistic culture when it came to the Cold War. All right, so that's kind of what's going on the mainstream. Amidst Reagan's administration, too, there were the continuing trend of covert military operations that we've seen over time. We studied it with Guatemala, with Iran, over and over again. The U.S. got involved in foreign affairs around the world that wasn't really our business, but we were doing it in the name of limiting the spread of communism. So a new one that happened was the Iran-Contra affair, sort of right in the middle of Reagan's administration. Now, basically what we were trying to do here was we took two actions that really couldn't be on the books for good PR, sort of public relations for the Reagan administration. Remember that that we were not on good terms with Iran because of the hostage situation, because of their revolution, but they also wanted to buy weapons from us. So what we did is off the books, so there was no record of it. The federal government sold weapons to Iran and then took that money and then funneled that money into support sort of anti-communist rebels down in Nicaragua. So this seems it's kind of a weird thing because the main idea was doing two things to support our Cold War policy, really without the American people knowing it. Once it came out that this did happen, it was a whole scandal for the Reagan administration. Lots of congressional depositions asking about what did the president know, when did he know it. Reagan claimed ignorance and that he didn't actually know what happened and kind of let his subordinates sort of take the brunt of what happened with this scandal. Now, something that goes along with those military interventions was the invasion of Grenada in 1983. So remember, this is just kind of a continuation of that idea of if we see radical left communist socialist ideas come up in places within our spheres of influence, we send in the military or the CIA in order to suppress those potential revolutions. What happened there in Grenada went very, very quickly, and it was viewed as kind of a successful intervention. Rather, if you look at Iran or Guatemala or especially the Bay of Pigs and see how they could actually be very messy. With unintended consequences of dictatorships at the end. Okay, just realize this is a continuing pattern into the Reagan administration. All right, next up is looking at what Reagan's policy was like in the Cold War as time went on. And you're going to see that his policy sort of shifted when it became clear that the Soviet Union was willing to shift its policy as well. So like I said at the beginning, he was bellicose. He had this rhetoric of being a very hardline person when it came to foreign policy in the Cold War. But again, as things changed, the Soviet Union showed they were willing to have compromise, so Reagan was willing to make compromise and sort of pursue a little bit of détente as well. Now, a lot of this was directed because the Soviet Union got a new leader in the 1980s. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev, and he was known as a reformer. So he was younger. He was not sort of as ingrained as past leaders had been in the Soviet Union. And basically, he looked at what was going on in the Soviet Union, that the fall was beginning to happen, and there was a lot of internal unrest, especially in satellite states. So what he wanted to do was bring on some reforms in the hope of preserving what the Soviet Union had so it would not sort of dismantle politically. That ends up happening anyway. Here's a couple of his policies. One was called perestroika. So that means restructuring, basically allowing more political and economic freedoms that had been typically denied within the Soviet Union. So in order to force communism on people, there was no freedom of speech, no freedom of the press. People couldn't privately own their businesses. Perestroika was restructuring the economy in order to allow those things, hoping that a little more sort of wiggle room in there would make sure that there wasn't widespread sort of dissent and unrest against the Soviet government. Similar things like this had been happening in China in the years before. Once China opened up and it starts to shift, what it eventually becomes to this day, where it's still, in name communist, but has some elements of capitalism as well. Gorbachev's other big policy was called glasnost, and that means openness. So basically, making the government more transparent to its people and being more open to international cooperation instead of antagonizing groups. So instead of the US and the Soviet Union always sort of butting heads, he said, you know what? Let's try to make compromises so we work together. So there's détente, so there's not this feeling of us being an evil empire or of us oppressing our people. Let's be more open in the process. So because of this, Reagan and Gorbachev formed a good working relationship in which they made some progress. In 1986, there was a summit of the Soviet Union and the US in Reykjavik, which is the capital of Iceland. Basically, they were trying to make agreements about what to do regarding our nuclear policy and how to have a better international relationship. Now, at one point in there, it was even on the table for both countries to completely disarm their entire nuclear arsenal. Now, that never happened, but it shows kind of a step forward that this was on the table, that it was actually being proposed, and both sides were really considering it. What they really come to instead in the next couple of years was something called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. What this meant is that there were no longer short or intermediate range missiles. So what that meant is there were still long range missiles, so they could be fired very long distances, but the ones that could only be shot short or intermediate distances were now agreed that both countries would get rid of them completely. So what that means is that it's going to be less easy in order for them to fight against each other in the short term. Okay, on sort of an immediate response. So it's a step forward, and there are agreements later on that start to have many nuclear missiles dismantled by both sides so that it's difficult, again, to go to war if you have to actually put the weapons back together to make them work. Okay, so what eventually happens to the Soviet Union? It eventually falls due to political changes and economic problems, as it says on the left, and okay. Now, one thing to realize is this happens once Reagan leaves office. So he kind of set the stage with American policy for bringing about the downfall. A lot of people give him credit for the collapse, but do realize that it happens after he leaves office. The Berlin Wall was taken down in 1989. The Berlin Wall was kind of this physical representation of that Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill talked about back in the late 1940s, of this divide between Western and Eastern Europe. In the case of the Berlin Wall, it was a physical wall that divided Germany into East Germany, which was influenced, kind of a puppet state of the Soviet Union, and West Germany, which was an independent republic that had good ties with the United States. Germany comes back together, the wall is taken down, some families that hadn't seen each other in decades reunite. It's viewed as this moment to show that communism was not working, and the people themselves, through sort of collaboration with the government willing to reform, were ready to take a big step forward. A couple years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union falls from within, and what happens instead is the Russian Federation, so Russia as it is today, forms out of that. The Communist Party, it's still a party there, but it's not the dominant party. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union used to be Russia plus all those satellite states. All those satellite countries now form independent nations as well. So ones like Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all the stands when you start to get into Asia, they become independent countries, no longer controlled by the Soviet Union. So while this is happening, what did the US do? We kind of took a back seat. So for a long time, we had been making progress with working with the Soviet Union as sort of a, kind of that realpolitik idea of that we were both big powers, we had to work together at some point. But because we could see it was falling apart, we did not take credit, we did not interfere, we let it dismantle on its own to avoid a diplomatic crisis. So this was happening under Reagan's successor, George H.W. Bush, who was his vice president when he was president. And basically, Bush was glad to see that the Soviet Union fell, but he didn't want to take credit for it and didn't want to make more problems for us if it made it look like we're like, oh, look, we won the Cold War, haha, in your face. He didn't want it to be that way because he knew that Russia would be a new country, and just like the Soviet Union, it was a country that we would have to have international relations with. There was no point in sort of burning bridges for the future. All right, our last slide here about how the end of the Cold War sort of changed some stuff. So we're the last superpower as a result, and we're still doing things that we had done in the past. So policies of regime change, and this sort of sparked, should we be doing this? Should we be interfering in countries around the world when those countries' decisions don't go in line with our vision as a country? So a little bit about where this is going first was George H.W. Bush. He was Ronald Reagan's vice president and gets elected in 1988 under what we call the Reagan coalition. That means a very solid, strong Republican Party plus a lot of Democrats. There were people back in 1984 called Reagan Democrats. This idea of, hey, we may not be Republican, we may not be conservative, but he seems to be doing things that are working, so we're going to vote for him anyway. Bush gets elected kind of riding that wave, and as a president, he continued economic and political policies that his predecessor had done. Now, how does he fit into the ideas that you see on the left with peacekeeping interventions? What he's most famous for in his one term as president was the Persian Gulf War, in which the U.S. military invaded Iraq after their leader and dictator Saddam Hussein had invaded another neighboring country, Kuwait. There was this fear that Saddam Hussein was going to invade Kuwait, take it over, and seize their oil reserves. Now, Kuwait was its own country that we wanted to do business with to trade for oil, so we didn't want that to happen. So, what happened? He sends in the military, more or less unilaterally, and basically we go into Kuwait, we chase the Iraqi military back into Iraq, and we get out of there. So we don't stay, we don't try and change the regime, we don't try to topple Saddam's administration. We just say, get out of Kuwait, go back up to Baghdad, and it was resolved. So in many ways, the Persian Gulf War is looked at kind of one of these, again, a successful intervention where it didn't take that long. The U.S. didn't have many losses in the process, and we did not have legacy costs with this specific war afterward. People in Bush's administration at the time said, well, of course we didn't want to go overthrow Saddam Hussein. Of course we didn't want to take over Baghdad. That was going to create legacy problems where we would be expected to stay there and to run the show, and then we would sort of get the resentment of the people who live there. Keep this idea I just said in mind because it's going to replay itself about a decade later. Bush also used the Marines to overthrow a dictator named Noriega in Panama, realized this is a dictator that we had previously been supporting, but his policies became so bad that we couldn't justify supporting him anymore, and we overthrew the very dictator that we had once supported. So basically this is showing you how when we interfered, especially in Latin America, we weren't thinking of long-term consequences, we were thinking of short-term, this guy is best for our needs. And then in some cases like this, we'd have to go and overthrow the very person we installed later on. Now, this trend of peacekeeping interventions is going to continue past George H.W. Bush. He runs again for president in 1992 and does not get reelected. Most of the times this is blamed on the fact that people felt he was out of touch with the American people. He made a promise not to increase taxes, and guess what he did as president? He increased taxes, so he couldn't avoid it. People viewed that he kind of went back on his promises, and who came forward against him was the Democrat Bill Clinton. Now, Clinton very much was a bit more likable. He seemed more like an average person. He had this sort of magnetic personality where he could make people feel like he truly cared about them. Now, whether he did or not, he certainly made it look like, I feel your pain, sort of he had a very attractive personality. Got elected in 92, re-elected in 1996. So all we're talking about for Clinton here are his peacekeeping interventions. He uses limited interventions. He did not have regime change in mind, but he does use the U.S. military with assistance and a permission from the United Nations to interfere in some countries where there was some really shady stuff going on. One was in Somalia in 1993. Somalia is on the eastern coast of Africa. So, with UN approval, we delivered relief supplies during a famine and a civil war. So you can see it wasn't about getting rid of that dictator or getting rid of the regime. It was saying, we have the money and the power to help people. We're going to go in and do that. Another one was in Haiti in 1994. The U.S. assisted in making sure that their elections worked out democratically and that the results sort of did not skew for a dictatorship, but by us interfering, it did result in a military coup. Later on, the United Nations and former President Jimmy Carter went in to try to fix that situation that we had helped to cause in a way. He also had strategic bombing of Iraq later on. So what it looked like is that Iraq was taking steps to make chemical weapons, that they were doing things that when you look back at the Persian Gulf War, they'd agreed not to do anymore. So we strategically bombed some of their military infrastructure to make it difficult for the Iraqi military to grow. And also in 1998, intervention in Yugoslavia. Basically, there began to be evidence of ethnic cleansing, of genocide of people of Albanian descent within Serbia. So before getting involved, we tried to use diplomacy to try and negotiate that, telling I can't remember the guy's name. I'll put his name in a little pop-up later. But making sure that leader knew that we knew what he was doing and he was going to face U.S. intervention if he didn't stop. Well, he didn't stop and the U.S. went in and that leader was later deposed. sort of by their own country, not by us. Okay, so next up after Bill Clinton as president was George W. Bush, son of George H.W. Bush. He was elected in 2000. He won the electoral vote, lost the popular vote. He gets reelected in 2004. Now, the election of 2000 was very contentious because it came down to one state. That state was Florida, to see who would win, George W. Bush or Al Gore. Al Gore was Bill Clinton's vice president. Ultimately, it came down to what would be the deadline for the recount within Florida, and it went to the Supreme Court that had to rule that recounts constitutionally had to end by a certain date, and on that date, the results said that George W. Bush won, so he got the Florida votes, and therefore he got the presidency. Future evidence show that if the recount had continued, it's possible that Al Gore could have won. He would have been the president instead. So ultimately, the Supreme Court decided that election. But related to this slide, George W. Bush is going to have interventions in Afghanistan immediately after 9/11, trying to hunt down Osama bin Laden. And then later in Iraq, kind of as a follow-up to his father's own interventions in the Persian Gulf. Okay, now those two interventions will define what we talk about in our very last video, the next one, the war on terror. But you need to realize that what was being done in those places was really nothing new. Look at this entire slide and look at things all the way back in the early Cold War to show that we interfered in countries around the world when our interests were no longer being met. And we took steps, again, not always thinking about the long-term consequences, but what did we need in the short term to get our way. Okay? Here we go. Well, actually, before I say that, you can see, like, with what I just said, how those ideas contribute to why there is a continuing debate on the appropriate use of American power in the world. I mean, it's up to you to decide, was it appropriate that we interfere in all these places, or should we stay out of it? Are we this world police, or are we sort of on equality with all these countries around the world? I'm not telling you what to think. Alright, thank you so much for watching. You know what to do. You've got some note cards to create, red or yellow terms. The quizzes for this historical period are extra credit. They're due of the very last day of school, or at least by then. One last geography assignment. Chronology, you're going to have a chronology final that you need to study for. And there's one more video to end everything right after this. So, this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in class.